The room was quiet when he said it. Not angry, not loud, just tired, as if the conclusion had been obvious for years. "You're useless." No one reacted, not his sister, not the accountant sitting across the table, not even the lawyer who kept looking down at his notes. I remember the way the words stayed in the air after he said it. Useless. I did not argue. I did not correct him. That seemed to confirm what they already believed about me. That I had no place in the decisions being made that morning. No voice in what would happen to the house, or the company, or the inheritance my father left behind. They continued speaking as if I were not there, as if nothing important belonged to me. But there were records on that table, and eventually records speak. For a long time, my life moved quietly inside routines that no one questioned. Morning began the same way every day. The house woke slowly. Light came through the kitchen windows before anyone else stepped downstairs. I made coffee. I checked the calendar. I answered small messages that arrived overnight. Nothing dramatic ever happened in those hours. The silence felt normal. My husband usually came down later, already reading emails on his phone, already thinking about meetings and numbers and decisions that belonged to his world. He rarely looked at the calendar on the wall. I kept it updated so he never had to. It worked that way for years. He handled the company. I handled everything else. No one ever said this arrangement out loud, but everyone behaved as if it were natural. When people visited the house, his colleagues, his sister, the accountant who came by every few months, the conversations always moved toward the dining room table. They talked about contracts, about growth, about the future of the company my father had started decades earlier. I usually stayed in the kitchen. Not because anyone asked me to leave, but because no one asked me to stay. At first, I believed that was simply how things worked. Business discussions were complicated. My husband and his sister both had degrees in finance. The accountant spoke a language made of numbers and legal terms that seemed far away from my everyday responsibilities. So I listened from the next room, and I trusted them. Trust was easy in the beginning because my father trusted him too. When my father grew older, he began bringing my husband into more meetings. I remember watching them at the dining table years ago, papers spread out in front of them. My father spoke slowly, explaining the history behind decisions the company had made long before I was born. My husband listened carefully then. He asked questions. He took notes. Sometimes my father would look toward the kitchen doorway where I stood, half inside the conversation and half outside it. He would smile. "Everything here will stay in good hands," he once said. At the time, those words felt comforting. I believed he meant my husband. After my father passed away, the house became quieter in a different way. His absence changed the rhythm of the place. Meetings still happened, but now they were framed as necessary adjustments, transitions, legal updates, structural decisions. That was the language they used. My husband spoke with more authority during those conversations. His sister visited more frequently, carrying folders and printed spreadsheets. The accountant started coming in the mornings instead of the afternoons. They spread documents across the same dining table my father once used. From the kitchen, I could hear the low tones of their voices. Sometimes they called me in briefly, usually to sign something. "Just a formality," my husband would say, sliding a page toward me with a pen already placed on top. I never felt pressure in those moments. Not at first. The papers looked official but ordinary. Most of them contained language about estate processing, property registrations, and business continuity. The lawyer had explained months earlier that these procedures were normal after a death. Everyone repeated that word. Normal. So I signed when they asked. Then I returned to the kitchen. Over time, a quiet pattern formed. Meetings happened without needing to include me. Decisions seemed to arrive already agreed upon. When people discussed the future of the company, they looked toward my husband for answers. He carried himself like someone who had already stepped into my father's place. No one challenged that, not even me. I told myself there was no reason to. He had always been confident in business matters. He spoke clearly, without hesitation, and people responded to that certainty. His sister supported him in conversations, often finishing his sentences when discussions became technical. Together, they created an atmosphere where everything sounded decided before it was fully explained. And I accepted that rhythm. Part of me believed my role was simply to maintain calm around those decisions. The house needed stability. People came and went through the front door almost every week. Employees from the company visited sometimes, bringing documents that required signatures. I welcomed them. I offered coffee. I kept things orderly. They were always polite, but rarely curious about my opinions. When conversations drifted toward business matters, they turned slightly away from me without meaning to. The focus returned to my husband, as if authority naturally gathered around him. I watched it happen many times, and I never interrupted. Not because I had nothing to say, but because silence had become the safest way to keep everything steady. Looking back now, I realize how easy it was for everyone to assume that silence meant understanding, or agreement, or even ignorance. But silence can also be observation. At the time, though, I still believed the system around us was built on trust. My father had trusted it, and I trusted the people sitting at that table. At least, in the beginning. The first change was small enough that it could have meant nothing. A conversation that ended when I walked into the room. It happened one afternoon while my husband and his sister were sitting at the dining table. Papers were spread across the surface, the same way they had been for months. Their voices were low, steady, focused. I stepped in to bring coffee. The moment I set the cups down, the room fell quiet, not abruptly, not awkwardly, just finished. My husband folded one document and slid it into a folder. His sister closed her notebook. "Thanks," he said without looking up. Then they began speaking about something else. Weather, traffic, small things. I stood there for a moment longer than usual, waiting for the conversation to return to whatever they had been discussing before. It never did, so I left the room. At the time, I told myself I was imagining it. People pause conversations all the time. There was no reason to assume it meant anything more than a natural shift in topic. Still, I noticed it. After that day, similar moments appeared quietly in the background of ordinary routines. Phone calls that stopped when I entered the room. Documents that were gathered together before I could read the top page. Occasional meetings scheduled while I was out of the house running errands. None of it looked serious on its own. Each moment could be explained easily, but together they created a faint sense that something was happening just slightly outside the circle where I stood. My husband began mentioning my father's estate more often, but the way he spoke about it had changed. Before, he referred to it carefully. "The estate needs time to settle. The lawyer will handle the details." Now the language felt different. "We'll need to restructure some of the holdings. I'm already reviewing the company assets. I spoke with the accountant about transferring certain responsibilities." The word reappeared frequently. Sometimes I wondered who he meant when he said it. I assumed he meant the family. But when his sister visited, the discussions often continued long after I returned to the kitchen. Their voices stayed low. Once, I passed the dining room and heard her say something quietly. "Does she know about the restructuring yet?" There was a pause. Then my husband answered in a tone I had not heard before. "It's not necessary right now." I did not stop walking. There are moments when the body continues moving before the mind understands what it just heard. I reached the kitchen and stood at the sink for a while, letting the water run longer than necessary. It would have been easy to walk back into the room and ask a simple question. What restructuring? Why would I need to know later? But something about the calm certainty in his voice stopped me. It did not sound like someone planning to explain something later. It sounded like someone closing a door quietly. Over the next few weeks, paperwork began appearing on the dining table more frequently. Some documents were thick with legal language. Others were spreadsheets printed in small font. When I entered the room, the top pages often disappeared beneath others. Again, none of it looked deliberate enough to accuse anyone of hiding something, but the pattern was difficult to ignore. One evening, my husband mentioned selling a portion of the company's warehouse property. He said it casually while scrolling through messages on his phone. "We may liquidate a few assets," he said. The words felt strangely formal for a conversation in our living room. "Why?" I asked. He shrugged. "Efficiency." That was the entire explanation. I waited for more details, but he had already returned his attention to the phone. Later that night, after he went upstairs, I walked past the dining room again. Several folders had been left open on the table. I did not read them carefully. I only looked at the headings on the first page: asset reallocation, ownership adjustment, operational transfer. The language felt distant and technical, but one thing became clear: decisions were moving forward. Quietly, and I was learning about them only in fragments. The strange part was not the secrecy itself. It was the assumption behind it. No one seemed concerned that I might eventually notice these details. No one explained anything in advance. It was as if they believed I would accept whatever decisions appeared later, as if questions were unlikely. I stood in the dining room for several minutes that night, not reading, just looking at the papers spread across the same table where my father once explained every detail patiently. Then I closed the folders exactly the way they had been before, and I turned off the lights. At that point, I still believed there must be reasonable explanations for everything. But the quiet feeling that something was slightly wrong had already begun. It was not strong, not yet, just a small weight in the background of ordinary days, the kind of feeling most people ignore. At first, I did too. The first real red flag was not a conversation. It was a date, a small detail on the bottom corner of a document that should have meant nothing. I noticed it late one evening when the house had already gone quiet. My husband had gone upstairs earlier than usual, saying he had an early meeting the next morning. The dining room table was still covered with the folders he and his sister had been reviewing that afternoon. Normally, I would have cleared the table without looking closely. That night, I didn't. I sat down instead, not with suspicion at first, just curiosity, the same quiet curiosity that had been building for weeks. The documents were mostly financial summaries and property listings connected to my father's company, numbers arranged in careful rows, short descriptions of assets I had heard about my entire life: the warehouse property, the storage facility near the highway, 2 smaller buildings rented by long-term tenants. Everything looked orderly, professional. Then I reached the final page of one folder. It was an authorization form for something called a structural transfer review. The language was dense and formal, but one line stood out immediately: authorization date. I read it twice. The meeting where this document had been discussed happened earlier that afternoon, but the authorization date printed at the bottom was 3 weeks old. I sat still for a long time after noticing that. Dates can be wrong for many reasons. Typing errors happen. Documents are sometimes prepared in advance. None of those explanations are unusual. But the longer I looked at that page, the less it felt like a simple mistake. 3 weeks meant the decision existed before the conversation that supposedly created it, before the meeting, before anyone had mentioned the idea of a review. I closed the folder and placed it back exactly where it had been. Then I turned off the dining room light and went upstairs. I did not ask my husband about it, not the next morning, not the next day either. Instead, I started paying closer attention. Once you begin noticing details, it becomes difficult to stop. A few days later, another document appeared during a short meeting with the accountant. I was asked to sign a page confirming my acknowledgement of pending operational adjustments. The language was vague enough that it almost sounded harmless. But one sentence caught my attention. As previously agreed during the preliminary review period. I looked up from the page. I don't remember a preliminary review, I said quietly. The accountant adjusted his glasses. His eyes moved briefly toward my husband before answering. That's just standard phrasing, he said. It refers to internal planning stages. Internal planning. The words were smooth, practiced. My husband reached across the table and tapped the paper lightly with his finger. It's routine, he said. Nothing complicated. He pushed the pen toward me. For a moment, the room felt strangely still. The accountant was watching the paper. My husband was watching me. Neither of them seemed worried that I might refuse. That detail stayed with me longer than the document itself. Confidence often reveals more than secrecy. People who believe something belongs to them rarely expect resistance. I signed the page, not because I fully understood it, but because refusing in that moment would have started a conversation I was not yet ready to have. Later that week, another inconsistency appeared. This one was not in a document. It was in a conversation I was not supposed to hear. My husband was speaking on the phone in his office. The door was half closed, but voices carry easily through quiet hallways. I was walking past when I heard him say something that made me stop. Once the transfer is finalized, she won't have much involvement anyway. There was a pause. Then he added calmly, almost reassuringly, she's not interested in the business side. I stood there for a few seconds, not moving. The strange part was not the assumption itself. It was how confidently he said it, as if my lack of interest had already been confirmed somewhere, as if a conversation had happened that I could not remember. I continued walking down the hallway before he could notice I had stopped. Later that night, while he slept, I returned to the dining room again. The folders were still there. I opened them more carefully this time, reading instead of glancing. Page after page, dates, notes, preliminary approvals. Some sections referred to restructuring decisions that seemed to exist before the meetings where they were discussed. The pattern was becoming clearer, not obvious enough to accuse anyone, but consistent enough to suggest something important. Plans were moving forward, quietly. And the role I was expected to play in those plans appeared smaller than anyone had ever explained. For the first time, a different thought crossed my mind. Not suspicion, not anger, just a simple realization. They believed I was not paying attention, and that belief was shaping everything around me. The first time I asked a direct question, the room changed, not loudly. No one raised their voice, no one argued, but something in the air shifted the moment I spoke. It happened during another afternoon meeting at the dining table. My husband, his sister, and the accountant were reviewing documents again. The same quiet rhythm of paper sliding across wood, pens tapping softly against folders. I stood beside the table for a moment before sitting down. They noticed. That alone seemed unusual. Normally, I only appeared long enough to bring coffee or sign something. This time I stayed. My husband glanced at me briefly, then returned to the spreadsheet in front of him. "Is something wrong?" he asked, almost absent-mindedly. I looked at the stack of papers. Some of these documents mention decisions that happened before the meetings where they were discussed. No one spoke immediately. The accountant adjusted his chair slightly. My husband's sister leaned back and folded her arms. "What do you mean?" she asked. Her tone was calm, but there was something underneath it. A quiet kind of patience that adults sometimes use with children who misunderstand something simple. I picked up one of the documents. "The authorization date here," I said. "It's 3 weeks before the meeting." My husband sighed softly, not frustrated, just tired. "You're reading too much into formatting," he said, formatting. The word reduced the entire question to a technical misunderstanding. The accountant nodded once. "Yes," he said. "Documents are often drafted in advance. The dates reflect preparation stages." I listened carefully. Neither of them looked at the page while explaining it. They spoke from memory or assumption. "But the meeting notes say the decision was made that afternoon," I said quietly. My husband leaned back in his chair now, finally looking directly at me. His expression was calm, but there was impatience in it. "These are business procedures," he said. "They can be confusing if you're not used to them." The room became very still. I noticed his sister watching me closely now, not angry, studying, as if she were waiting to see whether I would push the conversation further. For a moment, I considered explaining everything I had noticed over the past weeks. The earlier dates, the phone call in the hallway, the language about restructuring that no one had discussed with me. But the way they were all looking at me made something clear. They had already decided what my questions meant. Not curiosity, confusion. And confusion was easy to dismiss. His sister smiled slightly, the kind of polite smile people use when trying to keep a conversation comfortable. "Estate transitions can be overwhelming," she said gently. "There's a lot of legal language." Her voice was careful, sympathetic, but the meaning underneath it was unmistakable. "You do not understand this." My husband slid another document across the table. "We're just trying to keep everything organized," he said. "Dad's company is complicated." He still called my father Dad. He tapped the paper again, offering the pen. "Just sign this so we can move forward." I looked at the page. It confirmed acknowledgement of ongoing asset adjustments. Another vague phrase. "What adjustments?" I asked. This time the silence lasted longer. My husband's sister exhaled slowly through her nose. My husband closed the folder in front of him with a quiet thud. "Look," he said. His tone had changed slightly now. Not angry, but firmer. "We've been managing this process for months. Everything is under control." I waited. He seemed to be deciding how much patience he still had for the conversation. Then he said something that stayed with me long after the meeting ended. "You don't need to worry about these details." The sentence sounded simple, helpful even, but it carried another message inside it. "You are not part of this." I placed the pen back on the table. "I'd like to understand it first," I said. My husband rubbed his temples slowly. The accountant stared at the papers. His sister tilted her head slightly, watching me with an expression that was almost curious now. And then my husband said the word, not loudly, not harshly, just with quiet exhaustion. "You're overthinking everything," he said. "Honestly, sometimes you make simple things difficult." He paused, then added the word that changed the room completely. "Useless." No one reacted. No one corrected him. His sister looked down at the table. The accountant pretended to review another document. The word hung in the air for a few seconds before dissolving into silence. I did not respond. I simply sat there. In that moment, something inside me shifted quietly. Not anger, something colder, understanding. Because the word had not been spoken in frustration. It had been spoken in certainty, as if the conclusion had already existed for a long time. Useless. I realized then that no explanation I offered would matter. Not in that room, not with those people, so I stopped asking questions, and they mistook that silence for surrender. After that meeting, the house returned to its usual rhythm, at least on the surface. Breakfast happened at the same hour, the dining table filled with papers during the afternoon. My husband's sister continued visiting with folders tucked under her arm, her tone always efficient, always certain. No one mentioned the word again. Useless. It was treated the same way people treat an awkward sound in the background of a conversation, something briefly noticed and then ignored. I did not bring it up either. Silence, I had learned, was often more revealing than confrontation. Instead of asking more questions, I began watching more carefully. The first real shift came from the lawyer handling my father's estate. He had always been a quiet man. During earlier meetings, he mostly listened while the accountant and my husband discussed financial structures and operational plans. When he did speak, it was usually to confirm that certain forms were legally required. But one afternoon, something about his tone changed. We were sitting at the same dining table again. The same stacks of documents, the same steady rhythm of pens moving across paper. My husband was explaining a proposal to restructure part of the company's warehouse assets. The explanation sounded confident, almost rehearsed. When he finished, the lawyer did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned a few pages in a thick folder and adjusted his glasses. Then he looked directly at me. "Before we proceed," he said calmly, "there are several clauses in your father's estate documentation that we should review together." The room became quiet. My husband leaned back slightly. "We've already gone through the estate framework," he said. The lawyer nodded. "Yes," he replied. "But there are some ownership conditions connected specifically to her." He gestured toward me. It was the first time during one of these meetings that someone had clearly identified me as a central part of the process rather than an observer. My husband's sister shifted in her chair. "What conditions?" she asked. The lawyer opened another document. "Certain company assets remain under a protective structure," he explained. "Your father arranged it years ago." My husband frowned slightly. "What kind of structure?" The lawyer read carefully from the page. "Assets transferred through the estate remain legally dependent on the beneficiary's approval for operational restructuring." The words sounded technical, but their meaning was simple, my approval, not my husband's. The room stayed silent for several seconds, then my husband laughed quietly. "That's just a formality," he said. The lawyer did not laugh. "Not exactly," he replied. He turned another page. "These clauses were written specifically to prevent automatic transfers of authority." I noticed something subtle then. The accountant had stopped writing. His pen was resting on the table. He looked at the documents with an expression that was difficult to read. My husband leaned forward now. "We've already begun restructuring some assets," he said. The lawyer nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. He paused before continuing. "And that is why we need to review the timeline carefully." The phrase timeline hung in the air. It sounded harmless, but something about the way he said it made the room feel heavier. My husband's sister crossed her arms. "What timeline issue?" she asked. The lawyer flipped to another page in the folder. "Some restructuring documents appear to reference approvals that may not yet exist." No one spoke. I looked at the papers spread across the table. For weeks, those documents had been moving through the room as if everything inside them were already settled. Now, for the first time, someone was questioning the order of events. My husband's voice became slightly sharper. "These are preliminary drafts," he said. "We discussed that earlier." The lawyer nodded again. "I understand," he replied calmly. "But the dates suggest that some operational actions may have been prepared before certain legal confirmations." Prepared before. the same pattern I had noticed weeks earlier. Only now it was being spoken aloud. The accountant cleared his throat quietly. "There's probably an administrative explanation," he said. The lawyer did not disagree, but he did not confirm that explanation either. Instead, he closed the folder slowly. "For clarity," he said, "I recommend we review the estate structure more carefully before moving forward with additional changes." His eyes moved briefly toward me again, not in a dramatic way, just a quiet acknowledgement. My husband seemed irritated now. "We've already spent months on this," he said. The lawyer's voice remained calm. "Your father spent years designing this structure," he replied. Then he added something that changed the atmosphere completely. He was very specific about who retained final authority. No one looked at me, but the meaning was unmistakable. For the first time since my father's death, the room had stopped assuming that control naturally belonged to my husband. And that realization had not come from me. It had come from the documents themselves, records, dates. Legal language written years earlier by someone who understood exactly how power could be misunderstood. I remained quiet during the rest of the meeting. No one asked for my signature that afternoon. And when everyone finally stood up from the table, the papers looked different somehow. Not because they had changed, but because the assumptions around them had begun to shift. Quietly, almost invisibly, just enough for the truth to start finding its way into the room. After that meeting, my husband began moving faster. The change was not announced. It appeared quietly in the rhythm of the house, in the number of phone calls he took behind closed doors, in the new folders that arrived almost every day. Before, the process had moved with a certain patience. Now there was urgency. I noticed it the next morning when he left the house earlier than usual. His coffee sat half-finished on the counter, something that had never happened before. He rarely left anything unfinished. Later that afternoon, his sister arrived carrying a stack of documents thicker than anything I had seen before. She walked straight into the dining room without greeting me the way she normally did. Their conversation started immediately. Low voices, fast, not the slow, measured discussions I had grown used to hearing through the walls. I stayed in the kitchen, listening only in fragments. "We need to finalize it now. Before the next legal review. The transfer has already started." The words came and went like pieces of a conversation that had begun somewhere else. When my husband eventually stepped into the kitchen, his expression was tight with concentration. "We're having another meeting tomorrow," he said. "About the estate," he nodded. "Just paperwork." The way he said it made the word paperwork sound heavier than usual. The following afternoon, the dining room filled again. My husband, his sister, the accountant, and the lawyer, the same people, the same table. But the atmosphere had changed. My husband spoke first, laying out a proposal to restructure several company assets connected to the warehouse property and a distribution facility my father had purchased years earlier. The explanation sounded confident, almost rehearsed. But this time, the lawyer interrupted before he finished. "Before we proceed," he said calmly, "I need clarification on the operational dates for these actions." My husband looked up. "What clarification?" The lawyer opened a folder and turned it toward the accountant. "These entries indicate that certain ownership adjustments were prepared weeks ago." The accountant adjusted his glasses again. "Yes," he said slowly. "Preliminary preparation." The lawyer nodded once. "But the estate conditions require confirmation from the beneficiary before such preparations move forward." Beneficiary. The word landed quietly in the center of the room. My husband leaned back in his chair. "This is getting overly technical," he said. The lawyer did not argue. Instead, he flipped to another page. There are also internal memos referencing operational instructions that appear to assume approval already exists. My husband's sister spoke before anyone else could respond. They were planning drafts, she said. Nothing final. The lawyer's tone remained steady. I understand, he said. Then he asked a question that seemed simple on the surface. Were any actions taken based on those drafts? No one answered immediately. I watched the accountant carefully. His pen moved once across the paper, then stopped. My husband spoke instead. We're trying to keep the company stable, he said. Waiting too long can damage operations. That may be true, the lawyer replied calmly. But the estate structure was designed specifically to prevent decisions from moving ahead without proper authorization. My husband's voice sharpened slightly. Authorization from who? The lawyer looked at the page. Then he answered quietly. From her. He nodded toward me. The room felt smaller somehow. For months, every conversation in that space had moved around me. Now, suddenly, everything was pointing back in my direction. My husband exhaled slowly. This is becoming unnecessary, he said. No, the lawyer replied. It's becoming clear. Silence settled across the table. The accountant shifted in his seat. My husband's sister tapped her fingers against the folder in front of her. For the first time since these meetings had begun, the system surrounding my father's estate was no longer moving smoothly in one direction. Questions had entered the process. Questions supported by documents, records, dates. And systems rarely ignore their own records. My husband turned toward me then. You've been reviewing the documents, haven't you? He said. The tone was neutral, but the meaning underneath it was sharper. I did not answer immediately. He studied my face for a moment. You're creating confusion, he said. I kept my voice calm. I've only been reading what's already written. His sister let out a quiet breath. This is exactly what we were worried about, she said. I looked at her. What were you worried about? She paused. Then she said something carefully, as if choosing each word. That you might misunderstand how these processes work. Misunderstand. The same word had appeared in different forms for weeks. Confused, overthinking, unfamiliar with business procedures. Now it sounded rehearsed. My husband leaned forward again. The company needs clear leadership right now, he said. Your father trusted me with that responsibility. I thought about my father then, about the years he spent building the company slowly, about the quiet conversations he used to have at this same table, and about the documents he had left behind, records that were now beginning to speak for themselves. I know he trusted you, I said. The room waited. But he also trusted the structure he built. The lawyer closed one of the folders. That structure, he said calmly, is exactly what we are reviewing now. The meeting continued for another hour. No one raised their voice. No accusations were spoken, but the tension never left the room. By the time everyone stood up from the table, one thing had become clear. The process that had been moving quietly in one direction for months was no longer under the control of the people who believed they were guiding it. The system had started asking its own questions. And systems, once they begin asking questions, rarely stop until every record is accounted for. That night, the house was very quiet. Not the normal quiet that came after dinner or late conversations. This was a heavier kind of silence, the kind that settles after people realize something has shifted, but no one is ready to speak about it. My husband went to his office and closed the door. His sister had left without saying goodbye. The dining room table was still covered with documents from the meeting, but no one had bothered to organize them before leaving. I stood there for a long time, looking at the papers. For months, that table had represented something simple in my mind. It was where decisions happened, where the people who understood business gathered to guide the future of the company my father built. I had believed that my role in those conversations was small, peripheral. Now the meaning of that table looked different, not because the papers had changed, but because the assumptions surrounding them had begun to collapse. I walked into the kitchen and sat down. For the first time since my father died, I allowed myself to think carefully about the situation without trying to protect anyone's intentions. Not my husband's, not his sister, S., not even my own earlier trust. The truth was quiet, but it was impossible to ignore now. They had been moving forward with decisions that assumed I would not stop them, not because I had agreed, but because they believed I would never question anything deeply enough to matter. The word useless came back to me again. Not the sound of it, the certainty behind it. It had not been said as an insult during an argument. It had been spoken like a fact, like a conclusion reached after years of observation. In his mind, I was someone who existed around the system but not inside it. Someone who would sign papers without reading them. Someone who would trust whatever explanation was offered. And until recently, he had been right. I had trusted him. I had trusted everyone sitting at that table. I sat there for a long time that night, listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling around me. Part of me wondered what would happen if I confronted him directly. If I walked into his office and placed the documents in front of him. If I asked why decisions had been prepared weeks before meetings where they were supposedly discussed. If I asked why conversations about restructuring happened without me present. But even imagining that conversation, I could already see how it would end. He would explain everything, carefully, confidently. His sister would support him. The accountant would confirm that business processes were complicated, and somehow the discussion would return to the same place it always had. My misunderstanding, my lack of experience, my confusion about how companies operate. The system around them had already been designed to protect that narrative, but there was another system in the room too, the one my father had built quietly over many years. Legal structures, ownership conditions, approval requirements. He had not trusted people to behave perfectly forever. He had trusted records, processes, documents that could not be persuaded or embarrassed or talked into silence. I walked back into the dining room and looked again at the folders scattered across the table. Every page represented something simple: evidence, dates, signatures, conditions written long before anyone imagined this particular situation. I realized then that I did not need to argue with anyone. The truth did not depend on winning a conversation. It depended on letting the system work exactly the way it was designed to work. Quietly, patiently, without emotion. That realization felt heavier than anger would have, because it meant accepting something difficult. My husband had already made choices based on what he believed about me. He had already moved forward assuming that belief was correct. Nothing I said now would change the path he had chosen. Only the records could do that. I closed the folders one by one, stacking them neatly. Then I turned off the dining room light. Before going upstairs, I passed the door to my husband's office. I could hear his voice inside. Low, tense. Another phone call, probably about the same documents we had just reviewed. I did not stop. For the first time since all of this began, I understood exactly what my role would be from this point forward. Not confrontation, not defense, restraint. I would sign nothing else without reading it carefully. I would attend every meeting. And most importantly, I would allow the systems my father built to continue their work. Because systems, unlike people, do not forget what is written inside them. And once they begin revealing the truth, there is no conversation powerful enough to stop them. The next formal meeting happened 3 days later. No one announced it as anything unusual. My husband simply said the lawyer needed to clarify a few details before the estate process could continue. But the tone in his voice was different, tighter, controlled. The dining room looked the same as always when everyone arrived. Papers were arranged in careful stacks. The accountant placed his laptop beside a thick binder. My husband's sister sat with her arms folded, watching the table as if the documents might change shape while we waited. The lawyer arrived last. He carried a large folder I had not seen before. When he sat down, he placed it directly in the center of the table. For a moment, no one spoke. Then he opened it. "These are the original structural documents your father filed when he reorganized the company assets 15 years ago," he said calmly. My husband nodded once. "Yes, we're aware of the structure." The lawyer did not respond to that. Instead, he turned the first few pages toward the accountant. "I've reviewed the timeline of the operational changes proposed over the past several months," he said. The word timeline appeared again. I noticed my husband's sister glance briefly at him. The lawyer continued. "Some of the actions discussed in recent meetings appear to assume authority that the estate documents do not grant automatically." My husband leaned back in his chair. "We've been through this already," he said. "Not fully," the lawyer replied. He turned another page. "Your father created a protective structure that places final authority for certain company assets with the primary beneficiary." He paused slightly. Then he looked at me. "Which is her?" The room stayed silent. The accountant cleared his throat softly. "Yes," he said, "that part of the structure is correct." My husband's voice remained calm, but there was strain in it now. "And that authority can be delegated," he said. "Yes," the lawyer replied, "through written approval." No one moved. The lawyer slid several documents across the table. "These are the restructuring drafts created earlier this year," he said. I recognized the pages immediately. They were the same documents I had looked at late at night weeks earlier. The lawyer placed another document beside them. "This is the estate condition attached to those assets." He pointed to a paragraph. The language was formal but unmistakable. "No restructuring or operational transfer involving the protected assets could proceed without direct written authorization from the beneficiary." My authorization. My husband reached for one of the drafts. "These were only preparation documents," he said. The lawyer nodded. "Preparation is not the issue." He tapped the page gently. "Implementation is." The accountant leaned forward now, reading carefully. A long moment passed. Then he spoke quietly. "Some of the operational planning assumed approval would follow." The lawyer looked at him, but approval did not occur. The accountant did not answer. Instead, he closed the folder slowly. My husband's sister spoke next. "This is being exaggerated," she said. "Nothing final has happened." The lawyer remained calm. "Certain preliminary actions have already been entered into company records," he said. My husband's voice sharpened slightly. "They were internal adjustments." "Yes," the lawyer replied. "Adjustments based on authority that had not yet been granted." The room felt very still. No one looked at me, but the meaning of the conversation had shifted completely. For months, every assumption in this house had pointed in one direction. My husband would take control of the company's structure. I would remain somewhere nearby, signing papers when necessary. Now the documents were revealing something different, not through accusations, not through emotion, through records. My husband placed the papers back on the table. "What happens now?" he asked. The lawyer answered without hesitation. "Further restructuring must pause until proper authorization is confirmed." "And if it is?" my husband asked. The lawyer closed the folder. "Then the structure your father created remains exactly as it is." No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, the accountant gathered his laptop. "We'll need to review the company entries carefully," he said. My husband's sister stood up slowly. The confidence she usually carried into these meetings had disappeared. My husband remained seated. His eyes moved across the table once more, past the lawyer, past the accountant, and finally toward me. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say. The truth had already been spoken, not by me, not by anyone in the room, by the records themselves. And records rarely leave space for argument. After that meeting, the house became quieter than it had ever been. Not empty, just different. The dining room table was cleared for the first time in months. The folders were gone. The constant movement of papers and discussions had stopped. The company continued operating, but decisions moved more slowly now. Carefully, every proposal required review. Every adjustment required confirmation. The structure my father built was no longer something people spoke around. It was something they had to follow. My husband spent more time in his office. Sometimes I could hear him on the phone late at night, his voice lower than usual, explaining things to people who expected different answers. His sister visited less often. When she did, the conversations stayed short, practical, professional. No one used the word useless again. In fact, very few personal words were spoken at all. We moved through the same house like people who had learned something important about each other but did not know how to discuss it. One evening, weeks later, I walked into the dining room and sat at the table where everything had unfolded. The surface was clear. No papers, no folders, just quiet. For a long time, I thought about my father sitting there years earlier, explaining decisions patiently to anyone willing to listen. He had always believed that systems mattered more than promises, that records would outlast assumptions. At the time, I thought he was simply being cautious. Now I understood something else. He had not built those structures because he distrusted people. He built them because he understood how easily people misunderstand power. Outside the window, the evening light faded slowly. The house remained silent. There was no victory in that silence, no celebration, just the quiet weight of reality settling into place. The company still existed, the structure still held, and the truth, written years ago in careful legal language, had simply waited long enough to be seen.